Denzel Washington's voice cracked in the middle of Family Feud, and the entire studio went silent. The 65-year-old legend, who had commanded movie screens for 4 decades, suddenly seemed smaller, vulnerable, human. Steve Harvey, who had seen everything in his years of hosting, found himself facing something he wasn't prepared for. One of Hollywood's greatest actors admitting his deepest fear on live television. It was supposed to be another episode of Celebrity Family Feud. The Washington family versus the Smith family, all for charity, all for laughs. Denzel had brought his wife Pauletta, their son John David, and Pauletta's sister. They were relaxed, joking during rehearsal, and Denzel seemed to be enjoying the break from his usual intensity. Steve Harvey was in his element, cracking jokes about Denzel's serious movie roles, getting laughs from the audience who were thrilled to see the Oscar winner in such a casual setting. The studio lights blazed with their usual warmth. The audience was energetic, filled with fans who had won tickets specifically hoping to see Denzel Washington in person. Everything felt normal, routine. Steve had hosted celebrity episodes before. Actors, musicians, athletes, and they usually followed the same pattern. Stars would ham it up for the cameras, everyone would have fun, and the charity would benefit. Simple television magic. But television has a way of revealing truths that even the most skilled actors can't hide. The first 2 rounds went exactly as expected. Denzel's competitive nature came out, and he was strategic about his answers, consulting with his family before buzzing in. The audience loved seeing his famous intensity applied to guessing what 100 people might say about everyday topics. Steve was having fun too, doing his signature reactions to unexpected answers, and building that rapport that made Family Feud special. Then came the 3rd round. The category seemed innocent enough. Name something people worry about as they get older. Standard Family Feud fare. Steve had asked similar questions hundreds of times. The answers were usually predictable. Health, money, being alone, forgetting things. Nothing that would create television history. John David Washington buzzed in first. Health problems, he said confidently. Ding. Number 2 answer, 23 points. The family celebrated, and Steve moved down the line to Pauletta. Being a burden to your children, she answered thoughtfully. Another ding. Number 4, 18 points. More celebration, more energy building. Steve worked his way through the family, getting solid answers, building points. The game was flowing perfectly. Then he reached Denzel standing at the end of the podium, that familiar intensity in his eyes that had captivated audiences in Training Day, Malcolm X, and countless other films. "All right, Denzel," Steve said with his trademark grin, "something people worry about as they get older. You're looking at this like it's an Oscar-winning performance, man. What you got?" The audience laughed. Denzel smiled that charming smile that had made him America's leading man for decades. He stepped up to the microphone, and for a moment, everything seemed normal. Then something shifted. Denzel looked out at the audience, then at Steve, then down at his hands gripping the podium. When he spoke, his voice was quieter than usual, lacking the commanding presence that had defined his career. "Being forgotten," he said. The words hung in the air, not just because they might not be on the board, but because of how he said them. There was something raw in his voice, something real that cut through the game show atmosphere. Steve sensed it immediately. In 40 years of entertainment, from stand-up comedy to hosting, he had developed an instinct for when someone was sharing more than just an answer to a survey question. "Being forgotten," Steve repeated, but his usual energy was tempered. He looked at Denzel with new attention. Buzzer sound. Not on the board. Normally this would be when Steve would crack a joke, move to the next family member, keep the energy high. Instead, he found himself studying Denzel's face. The actor was staring at the floor, his jaw working like he was chewing on something bitter. "You all right, man?" Steve asked, stepping closer to the podium. Denzel looked up, and Steve saw something in those eyes that made his chest tighten. It was vulnerability, pure and unguarded, the kind that actors spend their careers learning to portray but rarely show in real life. Denzel started, then stopped. He glanced at his family, at the cameras, at the audience full of people who saw him as larger than life. I just turned 65, Steve. The admission came out like a confession. The audience was still smiling, not yet understanding that something profound was happening on their favorite game show. Steve Harvey had interviewed thousands of people. He knew when someone needed space to speak, when the game mattered less than the human moment unfolding in front of him. 65, Steve repeated softly. That's a big number. Yeah, it is. Denzel's voice cracked slightly on the words. And I keep thinking, what if I'm not good enough anymore? What if the young directors don't want to work with an old man? What if audiences get tired of seeing the same face they've been watching for 40 years? The studio was getting quieter. The audience was beginning to sense that this wasn't part of the usual Family Feud banter. Steve Harvey made a choice. He set his cards down on the podium and stepped closer to Denzel, abandoning his hosting position entirely. Talk to me, Steve said, and his voice had shifted too. This wasn't Steve Harvey, the game show host, anymore. This was Steve Harvey, the man, the father, the human being who understood something about getting older in the public eye. Denzel took a shaky breath. I wake up some mornings and look in the mirror, and I don't recognize myself. My hands shake sometimes when I'm holding the script. My memory isn't what it was. And I think, what if this is it? What if I've already given my best performances and I'm just fading away? The words came out in a rush, like they'd been building pressure inside him for months, maybe years. The audience was completely silent now, sensing they were witnessing something rarely seen, a legend revealing his humanity. Steve felt his own throat tighten. At 56, he wasn't far behind Denzel, and every fear the actor was expressing resonated in his own chest. Man, Steve said quietly, I hear you. I really hear you. But Denzel wasn't finished. The floodgates had opened, and decades of carefully maintained public composure were cracking apart. You know what scares me most? Denzel continued, his voice dropping to almost a whisper. It's not dying, it's becoming irrelevant. It's having people look at me and think, oh, that's that old actor who used to be good. It's my children feeling embarrassed when someone asks what their father does. Pauletta reached over and touched his arm, her eyes glistening. John David stepped closer to his father, the usual playful family dynamic replaced by something much deeper. Steve Harvey had hosted over 3,000 episodes of Family Feud. He had seen contestants break down over money, over family pressure, over the excitement of being on television. But he had never seen anything like this. A man at the pinnacle of success confronting the reality of his own mortality on live television. I spent my whole life building this career, Denzel continued, and now his voice was openly shaking. Playing these strong characters, being the guy who has all the answers, who saves the day, who never shows weakness. And now I'm just scared. I'm scared that everything I've worked for is slipping away, and there's nothing I can do to stop it. The admission hung in the studio air like smoke. 200 audience members sat in complete silence. The production crew in the booth had stopped their usual chatter. Even the cameras seemed to pause, as if the operators sensed they were capturing something extraordinary. Steve Harvey looked at Denzel Washington, this titan of cinema, this man who had portrayed presidents and preachers, soldiers and saints, and saw himself. He saw every middle-aged man who had ever looked in the mirror, and wondered if his best days were behind him. Without thinking, without considering the cameras or the audience, or the show that was supposed to continue, Steve Harvey did something unprecedented. He walked over to Denzel and put his arm around his shoulders. Brother, Steve said, his own voice thick with emotion, let me tell you something. The studio was so quiet you could hear the air conditioning humming in the background. I'm looking at one of the greatest actors who ever lived, Steve continued. I'm looking at a man who has given us Malcolm X, who showed us what it means to be a father in fences, who made us believe in miracles, and he got game. You think that's something people forget? Denzel's shoulders shook slightly under Steve's arm. But more than that, Steve went on, I'm looking at a man who just showed more courage in the last 5 minutes than most people show in a lifetime. You think being vulnerable is weakness? Man, what you just did, that's the strongest thing I've seen in 40 years of entertainment. The camera slowly zoomed in on the two men, one black actor, who had defined excellence for a generation, the other a comedian turned host, who understood the weight of expectations and the fear of falling short. You know what nobody tells you about getting older in this business? Steve asked, his voice carrying across the silent studio. It's not about staying relevant. It's about staying real. And brother, what you just showed us, that's the realest thing that's ever happened on this stage. Denzel lifted his head and looked at Steve, tears visible in his eyes for the first time. I just don't want to disappoint people, he said quietly. Disappoint people. Steve's voice rose slightly, filled with incredulous affection. Man, you just gave every person in this audience permission to be human. You just showed them that even Denzel Washington has moments of doubt, and you know what that means? It means they're not alone in theirs. The audience began to murmur agreement, a gentle sound of recognition and understanding. You think your legacy is about the movies you've made? Steve continued. Those are just films, man. Your legacy is moments like this, when you chose to be real instead of perfect, when you chose to show your heart instead of hiding it. Denzel nodded slowly, wiping his eyes with the back of his hand. I needed to hear that, he admitted. We all did, Steve replied. Every single person in this room needed to hear that. Because we're all aging, we're all scared sometimes, and we all need to know that it's okay to not have all the answers. Steve looked out at the audience, then back at Denzel. You know what I think happens when we get older? Steve asked. I think we stop performing and start living. I think we stop trying to be what people expect and start being who we really are. And brother, who you really are, that's more powerful than any character you've ever played. The studio erupted in applause, not the usual game show applause, but something deeper, more meaningful. People were standing, wiping their own eyes, recognizing something profound in what they had just witnessed. Denzel straightened up, his posture returning to something closer to his usual commanding presence, but with a new kind of softness around the edges. Thank you, he said to Steve, his voice stronger now. I didn't know I needed to say that out loud. Sometimes we don't know what we need until it's right in front of us, Steve replied. The two men shook hands, but it turned into an embrace. Two professionals who had found something human in the middle of a television show. Steve picked up his cards and looked at the cameras, then at the audience. Ladies and gentlemen, he said, his voice still thick with emotion. I've been hosting this show for years, and I've never been prouder to be standing on this stage. What just happened here? This is why we do television. Not for the laughs, not for the prizes, but for moments like this. When we remember that behind every famous face, every successful person, every person period, is a human being with fears and hopes and the courage to be real. The applause continued, longer and more sustained than any game show moment deserved, because it wasn't about the game anymore. It was about recognition, about connection, about the rare gift of seeing someone you admire reveal their humanity and finding your own reflected back. When the episode finally aired 3 months later, it broke viewership records. Not because of celebrity appearances or funny answers, but because audiences recognized authentic human connection when they saw it. The moment became a cultural touchstone, shared across social media with captions about vulnerability, aging, and the courage to be real. Denzel Washington returned to making movies, but something had shifted. His performances carried a new depth, a willingness to show vulnerability that enhanced rather than diminished his power as an actor. In interviews, he began speaking more openly about the challenges of aging in Hollywood, becoming an advocate for older actors, and a voice for authentic representation. Steve Harvey found himself changed too. His approach to hosting became more attuned to the human moments, more willing to let the game stop when life needed to be acknowledged. He began incorporating conversations about vulnerability and authenticity into his other shows, creating space for real moments in an industry built on performance. But perhaps the most important impact was on the millions of people who watched that episode and recognized their own fears, reflected in one of the most successful actors of his generation. They saw that doubt and vulnerability weren't signs of weakness, but marks of humanity. They learned that even legends have moments when they need reassurance, when they need to be reminded of their worth. That day on Family Feud, something extraordinary happened. A game show became a mirror, reflecting not just entertainment, but truth. An actor stopped acting and started being. A host